Welcome to the Biblical Preaching Podcast, where we want to ponder preaching that points people to Jesus, transforms lives, builds churches, and changes the world.
This is your conversation about the heart of preaching, and we're really glad that you're here.
So this is episode 1. Welcome to episode 1 of the Biblical Preaching Podcast. We are going to think about a very basic question, and that is, why preaching? Why do a podcast about it? But forget the podcast, why preach at all? Where does that whole thing come from? So we want to think about why preaching, and then why have we called it biblical preaching? So Mike, do you want to kick us off? Why preaching at all?
Well, let's start with a biblical reason for why there's preaching. There's biblical examples of preaching. So you can think of Moses right back, and the writer of so much of the Old Testament, but Moses, the prophet, was a preacher. Lots of models there of preaching. His assistant Joshua, again, preaching was one of their main modes of communicating God's word to the people. But you can fast forward quite a long way through the Bible, but even Jesus and his disciples and the apostles, they were preachers too. Jesus certainly communicated through preaching. The apostles set up the church in many ways through their preaching.
It's interesting. Sometimes people say, well, preaching in the Bible was a thing, but times have changed, and we're in a different culture, in a different world right now, and so maybe preaching isn't a thing anymore. But actually, just as you're talking about those examples from Moses and Joshua, through the prophets to Jesus and the apostles, times changed then as well. That's a massive span of history, jumping forward, 1,500 years or something like that, across different kind of cultural settings. You've got Paul preaching in Greece, Moses preaching in Sinai. Like, these are real different places in history, and yet there's a consistency throughout that there's something about the spoken word.
Yeah, and there's a consistency of that even since Bible times, since the Bible was written, and there's been that. I would say the consistency of preaching as communication through 2,000 years of church history too.
That's true. Yeah, I suppose there's also the biblical instruction. There's places where the Bible says to teach or to preach, and another time we'll talk about the difference between preaching and teaching. But there's kind of instructions to do so. So, for example, Paul, right at the end in 2 Timothy, his final letter, just before his life comes to an end on this earth, Paul is writing to Timothy, and it's interesting that the thing that he tells him to do is to preach the word. And so that 2 Timothy 4 verse 2, preach the word in season, out of season, all of the kind of instructions wrapped around it. But the main thought there is preach the word. And so we could chase through the Bible and come up with lots of similar kind of instructions, which we could then apply to ourselves. But I suppose actually thinking about it, there's a bit of a theological foundation here. It's not just, is there preaching in the Bible? Of course. Is there instruction to preach in the Bible? Yes. But even kind of going below the surface theologically, there's something about our God that means that preaching makes sense.
Yeah, right.
So what is God like? That's really the question that we ask in theology, isn't it? What is God like? And our God is a God who reveals. That's his nature. He wants to reveal himself to us, which means there's content, there's information, there's something to know, which therefore implies words. He's a revealer. He's a speaker. God spoke everything into existence. God was speaking before the creation of the world. So God is a revealer. He's a speaker. And even at the level of the incarnation, he's an incarnating God. So the fact that God the Son becomes a human is an act of communication. And so as preachers, we're, in a sense, entering into the world of our listeners and bringing to them a message that we're trying to sort of enflesh with words, if that's such a thing, in order to communicate. So I think going back to the nature of God himself as revealer, as a speaker, as an incarnational God, it kind of undergirds preaching, doesn't it?
If what you're saying, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but if what you're saying is we talk about preaching because God essentially is a preacher, then it matters the kind of God we're talking about.
Yeah.
It matters, like you said, what God is like, who he is, and if he's revealed himself to us in and through Jesus as a God of Trinity, then that's actually, it's not just foundational in kind of all of theology, but as we're thinking about preaching and communicating, that him as Trinity matters. So as Father, Son, and Spirit, that matters when we think about preaching and what it is and how to do it. And the Father loving and initiating kind of relationship, Jesus as the Son revealing and rescuing, the Spirit as the one who invites us, who woos us, poured into our hearts, is the one that, yeah, like I said, it invites us to respond to the preaching of God, the communication of God. It's all wrapped up in so many of those kind of little facets that are just hugely foundational.
Yeah, it's like the three persons of the Trinity are actively involved in preaching, right? So as we preach, we are part of the Father's initiative, his love, his plan being worked out. We're pointing to the Son. Obviously, our preaching points to Jesus. And the Spirit is at work in that, hopefully, working in the hearts of the listeners and in the heart of the preacher as well. And so it's a very Trinitarian ministry, not just conceptually, but actually in practice. And that, even thinking about how the gospel works, think about how in the beginning we fell by distrusting the word of a God who did not appear to be present. Right. So in the Garden of Eden, Eve and then Adam fell because, did God really say? Can you really trust him with that? But actually, God's rescue plan is kind of that in reverse. He doesn't kind of swoop in with power, sort of destroying everything in his path to fix things. He says, okay, I'm going to rescue humans out of this fallen state, and they're going to do so as they trust in my word and respond to it spoken, even when they don't see me present.
Yeah, because it's not the kind of it's not the communication that is just shouting from a distance. Like you're saying with the incarnation, it's God coming in, coming close, coming down. So his preaching, his communication of the gospel, and of Jesus is coming to us clothed in the gospel. That communication is close and invitational. And so if we're thinking about, see, that's kind of preaching in general, but not all preaching is biblical preaching. So what are we meaning by this phrase biblical preaching? Is that the same as expository preaching?
Yes. It's funny, I sort of hesitate with the word expository, not because I have a problem with it, but because I have a problem with the way it gets applied to things.
Yeah.
So I often think of, some poor, unfortunate teenager sitting through a church service and, has zero desire to be there. The preaching's dire. The whole thing's a bad experience. But if they dare to complain, then they get told, well, this is good expository preaching. And so immediately it's got this kind of negative feel to it, where actually I would say it might not be expository at all. That label just gets used sometimes for something that's essentially a Bible lecture. So yeah, is biblical preaching what we mean by expository? Yes, but I'm not sure it's helpful. In fact, it feels a bit technical, doesn't it?
It's harder to spell,
Yes.
which is probably where we've gone for biblical preaching in terms of our podcast name. But yeah, it becomes a kind of its own type of genre.
Yeah.
And I guess what we kind of perhaps want to be thinking is, well, not is all expository preaching biblical? Well, you'd hope so,
Mm.
but we want to would be focusing in on being biblical, because in that sense, it's not merely, like I said, a type or a genre of preaching. It's not a type of preaching. It's much more of a kind of a philosophy of what preaching is. It's not how to. There's not biblical preaching, expository preaching is not 3 points, that kind of format.
Yeah.
It's much more than that, actually.
When I studied with Haddon Robinson, and he wrote the book Biblical Preaching, and I think it was released in England by maybe a different publisher, but it had the title Expository Preaching. And he was really annoyed by that because he said, that's got a negative feel to it. Biblical preaching is what we all aspire to be, and I want to kind of draw people into that. So that's why when I started my blog, I thought, well, I'll just use this title. No one else is using it. Biblical Preaching.net was the blog, and now Biblical Preaching Podcast. But it really is that sense of what I got from Haddon, which was it's a commitment to a philosophy, like you said, Mike. It's a commitment to an approach to preaching. So it's not that all sermons in this category are going to sound the same as each other. There's great variety possible, but all sermons that are genuinely expository or biblical will have some things in common, but not the form. It's a commitment to the role of the scripture in the passage or in the message. So how does the passage relate to the message? And that's what I often quote John Stott in his book, Between Two Worlds, where he said, expository preaching is where the Bible is boss. I kind of like that. It's just, is the text in charge of what I'm saying, or am I using the text to say something I want to say? If I'm using it, I'm not being expository, even though I sound really biblical. You see what I mean? So it's a commitment to, I'm putting myself as the preacher under the text and saying, okay, I want to communicate what this text is communicating, and that means that I'm not in charge, the text is. But I've got all sorts of flexibility in terms of how I actually preach it.
So what are some of those things that you would have in mind? So when you were saying about that, biblical preaching has elements of similarity kind of between preachers, kind of what is in your mind when you're thinking of kind of what, if there's a definition of biblical preaching or a definition of expository preaching, what do you think? So if it's not, if the form can be different, what are the things that are sort of the more non-negotiable?
I think that the non-negotiable things, there's basically in my mind 4. Okay, so something about God, something about the Bible, something about the preacher, something about the listeners.
Okay.
Now, how you actually phrase that, you can keep adjusting the phrasing of it until you get it published, and then you have to stick with it forever. But something about God. So in true biblical preaching, God is involved, God is at work. So, for example, in Haddon Robinson's definition, he includes the fact that the Holy Spirit first applies the message of the text to the preacher, and then through the preacher to the listeners. So it's that sense that God is involved in this. This is not sort of a lecture or a kind of an information transfer. This is something that is a spiritual event where God is at work. It's prayed for. God is hopefully moving in the preacher and in the listener. So God is over the whole thing and involved in the whole thing. Then in terms of the Bible, in terms of the text, the Bible is boss. So what does the Bible author intend to communicate in that passage? I can't make it say something better than it already says. Yeah. Right? So what does the text actually mean? I've got to get the meaning of the text. And then if I'm the preacher, move on to the third part, I want to communicate as effectively as I possibly can. So the message of the text effectively communicated through the preacher, and then that needs to come across and land in the lives of the listeners with relevance. So it's not just historic information they find fascinating. It's a word from God today, present tense, that's landing in their hearts and in their lives because I'm communicating it hopefully effectively. God's involved. The Bible's authority is timeless. So there's kind of those 4 elements. God's involved, the true meaning of the text effectively communicated through the preacher with relevance emphasized for the listeners. I think those are the 4 parts. But you can't say, and to be true biblical preaching, it must have 3 points. That's where you get into the form of a sermon rather than the philosophy of preaching.
Yeah, and you can hopefully kind of see, and I think we'll see over time as we kind of go through different episodes of the podcast, is that those 4 things matter. Saying they're non-negotiables is fine, but we're going to be referring to those things,
Yeah.
not always explicitly, but they're going to come up implicitly as well as we're in our discussions and interviews. Actually, those things really make a difference to preaching and to the effect of preaching. Now, one of the things that we're going to be doing towards the end of every podcast episode is just to have a little space really for encouragement, a bit of a kind of biblical preaching for you. So Peter, you've got something that I think you want to just give to us as an encouragement.
Yeah, just a quick thing.
Yeah.
If that's a thing. It's funny, isn't it? Because really what we're saying in that whole conversation about expository preaching or biblical preaching is that underneath it all, the foundational assumption is that God is a good communicator, right? And if God is a good communicator, then we're sort of reaching for what he's communicated already, rather than saying, step aside, Lord, I've got something better to share. And so that's where the Bible study, biblical insight becomes such treasure to us, because we're saying, I know this is better than my first assumption. I know this is better than what I already think. And so I'm going to dig into it and I'm going to understand it as well as I can, because I know God's a good communicator. Now, you're kind of setting me a challenge at the end, saying, okay, now you be a good communicator. Okay, this is not crafted sermon. This is not, this is a podcast. We talk about preaching. This is not a podcast where we take 25 hours to prepare a sermon for the final 2 minutes. But my mind goes to Matthew 28, Great Commission. Familiar passage, Matthew 28, verses 18 to 20. And I'm sure it's fairly familiar to many of us. Jesus gathering with his disciples, he gives them the great go command or instruction. Go therefore and make disciples. So the instruction is make disciples, that's the command, but the go has the same force as it. It's like, come on, off you go, lads. I want you to go make disciples of all nations. He gives them the two elements of what's involved in that. The teaching and the baptizing, or the baptizing and the teaching, bringing people in to God's family and building them up. Okay, so there's detail there. And we can look at that and we can say, oh yeah, this is great. This is what we're supposed to be doing. This is the kind of shove in the back that we need, right? We need to go make disciples of all nations. But sometimes we miss verse 20. And I think verse 20 is super encouraging for us as preachers. The final verse, behold, I am with you always to the end of the age. I think sometimes when we hear the word go, we can sort of put this space between us and Jesus. Like he's the one pushing us out into ministry while he sits in heaven doing the building project of, preparing our heavenly home or something. But actually, he concludes the Great Commission by saying, I'm with you always to the end of the age. So as we go to teach people to obey everything that he's commanded us, as we go to make disciples of all nations, as we're involved in that great commission project, which we all are, we're joining Jesus. And so everything we said before about the Trinity and, in our preaching is the initiative of the Father and the pointing to the Son and the Spirit's at work in the midst of it. We're joining Jesus in it. It's a cooperation, not a sort of distant sent role. So that's what I was pondering. I don't know. Is that encouraging, Mike?
Yeah, for sure.
Feels encouraging to me.
Yeah. Yeah. As we go, we're going with Jesus. It's his mission, his word, his gospel.
And so the next time you preach, maybe you're preaching tomorrow or 3 days from now, and it can feel so lonely. That's the thing. When you're preparing and you go, oh, Lord, I really want this to work, and you're preparing to actually, no, hang on a minute. We are going to preach. Lord, I need you to be at work in this. I'm joining you in what you're doing. And so instead of it being a lone ranger, right, I'm totally exposed. I'm now stood in the pulpit. Everyone's staring at me. I feel really awkward. I'm with Jesus and Jesus is with me. That's an encouragement.
Great. It's a great place to wrap up. We'll leave the listeners to go and preach. So with that ringing in heart. So thank you so much for joining us. At this time, we're grateful to have you on the journey with us. Do like and comment and ask questions that you have, but we'll be back for more pretty soon.
Thanks for joining us today. We really appreciate every positive review, like, share, and comment. And thank you for praying for us. We hope you will join us again next time on the Biblical Preaching Podcast.